my little one.
On July 11, 1767, in the coastal town of Braintree, Massachusetts, Abigail Adams endured a difficult labor in the family's saltbox farmhouse. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on the colonial landscape, and inside, the cries of a newborn boy filled the modest home. They named him John Quincy Adams, after his mother's grandfather, Colonel John Quincy, who had died just days before. Neither parent could have imagined that this infant, born into a world on the brink of revolution, would become the 6th President of the United States, a brilliant diplomat who would reshape American foreign policy, and ultimately, one of the greatest voices against slavery in the nation's history. The boy's arrival into the world coincided with the crescendo of colonial discontent with British rule. His father, John Adams, was already emerging as one of the most eloquent voices for American independence. A lawyer whose passionate defense of colonial rights made him both celebrated and controversial. His mother, Abigail, possessed one of the sharpest minds of her generation, though society offered her no formal education or public platform. Together, they created an intellectual household where politics, philosophy, and civic duty formed the very air young John Quincy breathed. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of revolution. When John Quincy was 7 years old, he stood with his mother on Penn's Hill. Watching the distant smoke and hearing the cannon fire from the Battle of Bunker Hill, the earth trembled beneath their feet, and the boy understood, in some primal way, that his world was changing forever. His father was away in Philadelphia, helping to birth a new nation, and Abigail had become both mother and father to their children. Managing the farm, educating the young ones, and writing letters to John that would become treasured documents of American history, Abigail proved to be an extraordinary teacher. She drilled young John Quincy in Latin and Greek, made him read classical literature and contemporary political philosophy, and instilled in him an almost crushing sense of duty and moral responsibility. The boy showed a precocious intellect and an unusual capacity for sustained concentration. While other children played, John Quincy could be found reading Plutarch's Lives or copying passages from Shakespeare. His mother's letters to his father often mentioned the boy's studious nature, but also her worry that he might be too serious, too burdened by expectation. In 1778, when John Quincy was just 10 years old, his father accepted a diplomatic mission to France. John Adams decided to take his eldest son with him, believing that exposure to European culture and politics would provide an education no American institution could match. The journey across the Atlantic in winter proved harrowing. Their ship, the Boston, encountered violent storms and engaged in battle with British vessels. Young John Quincy witnessed cannon fire and bloodshed, experiences that would have traumatized many children but seemed only to steel his resolve. Paris dazzled the boy from Massachusetts. He attended the Passé School and improved his French until he spoke it fluently. He met Benjamin Franklin, who found the serious young Adams somewhat amusing but undeniably impressive. John Quincy absorbed everything: the language, the politics, the art, the sophisticated conversation of the French salons. But after just months in France, his father's mission ended, and they returned to America. The respite proved brief. Within a year, John Adams was appointed minister to negotiate peace with Great Britain, and once again, he took his son to Europe. This second European sojourn proved even more formative. In 1781, at age 14, John Quincy traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, serving as secretary and interpreter for Francis Dana, the American envoy to the court of Catherine the Great. For 14 months, the teenage boy lived in the capital of one of Europe's great powers, navigating complex diplomatic situations, learning Russian, and developing a sophistication far beyond his years. When he finally left Russia, he traveled alone through Scandinavia and Germany to rejoin his father in the Netherlands. A journey of hardship and occasional danger that would have daunted many adults. In the Netherlands, John Quincy enrolled at the University of Leiden, becoming one of the youngest students at the prestigious institution. He studied with ferocious intensity, mastering Dutch, deepening his knowledge of Greek and Latin, and developing the habits of scholarship that would sustain him throughout his life. His diary entries from this period reveal a young man struggling with self-doubt despite his obvious brilliance, constantly measuring himself against impossibly high standards set both by his demanding parents and by his own perfectionist nature. By 1785, 18-year-old John Quincy had spent most of his adolescence in Europe. His father, now American minister to Great Britain, finally sent him home to prepare for college. The young man who returned to Massachusetts had lived in 4 countries, spoke multiple languages fluently, had witnessed war and diplomacy at the highest levels, and possessed a worldliness that set him apart from his provincial peers. Yet he had also missed the ordinary experiences of childhood and adolescence, had formed few friendships, and carried a burden of expectation that would have crushed a less resilient spirit. Harvard College accepted him as a junior, acknowledging his extraordinary education. He excelled academically, graduating second in his class in 1787, but struggled socially. His classmates found him bookish and aloof, while he found them frivolous and intellectually lazy. He delivered the commencement address, speaking on the importance and necessity of public faith to the well-being of a community, a topic that revealed both his precocious wisdom and his rather stern view of civic virtue. After graduation, John Quincy faced the question that confronts all young people: what to do with his life. His parents, especially his mother, had invested everything in his education and harbored enormous expectations. Despite his obvious gifts for diplomacy and politics, he chose to study law, reading with Theophilus Parsons in Newburyport, Massachusetts. The decision reflected both practical concerns about securing a livelihood and a desire to establish himself through his own merits rather than his father's influence. He opened a law practice in Boston in 1790, but his heart was never truly in it. The tedious work of drafting contracts and settling disputes bored him. Instead, he began writing political essays under various pseudonyms, defending his father's increasingly unpopular Federalist positions and engaging in the fierce partisan debates of the early Republic. His essays, published in prominent newspapers, displayed a sophisticated understanding of political theory and international affairs that caught the attention of both allies and adversaries. When George Washington became aware that the brilliant young writer was John Adams's son, he appointed 26-year-old John Quincy as minister to the Netherlands in 1794. The appointment sparked cries of nepotism, charges that would dog John Quincy throughout his career. Yet Washington insisted the appointment reflected merit, not family connection. In truth, it was both. John Quincy possessed unique qualifications for diplomatic service, but he also benefited from his famous name. The Netherlands posting proved to be merely the beginning of a distinguished diplomatic career. When his father became president in 1797, John Quincy was appointed minister to Prussia, a promotion that again raised accusations of favoritism. In Berlin, he negotiated a treaty of commerce and friendship, continued his voracious reading and study, and fell deeply in love with Louisa Catherine Johnson, the daughter of an American merchant. They married in 1797, beginning a partnership that would last more than 50 years but would never be easy. Louisa was born in England, elegant and refined, with a love of music and literature. She found John Quincy brilliant but emotionally distant, devoted to duty but often neglectful of her emotional needs. For her part, John Quincy's mother never fully accepted Louisa, considering her insufficiently American and too delicate for the rigors of public life. The marriage produced 4 children, though tragedy would mark their family when their daughter Louisa died in infancy and their sons struggled with alcoholism and depression in adulthood. When Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the bitter election of 1800, John Quincy lost his diplomatic post. The family returned to Massachusetts, where he resumed his half-hearted law practice and began dabbling in politics. In 1802, he was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate, and the following year, the state legislature elected him to the United States Senate. As a senator, John Quincy Adams immediately established himself as one of the most independent and principled members of that body, characteristics that would make him both admired and politically isolated. Though elected as a Federalist, he refused to follow party orthodoxy when it conflicted with his conception of national interest. He supported Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, despite Federalists' opposition. He backed the embargo policies that his own party detested. His willingness to work with Jefferson and later Madison infuriated Massachusetts Federalists, who viewed him as a traitor to their cause. The breaking point came in 1807 when Adams attended a Republican caucus meeting. The Massachusetts legislature, outraged by his apostasy, elected his replacement a year early, essentially forcing his resignation. Rather than fight to retain his seat, Adams quit the Senate. His brief legislative career apparently ended in failure and disgrace. His political opponents celebrated, certain they had heard the last of John Quincy Adams. They were spectacularly wrong. In 1809, President James Madison appointed Adams as the first American minister to Russia. The assignment took him back to St. Petersburg, where he had served as a teenage secretary nearly 30 years earlier. Now he returned as the official representative of a young nation to one of the world's great empires. Louisa accompanied him, despite her delicate health and the brutal Russian climate, leaving their two older sons in America for their education, a separation that caused her immense pain. The Russian years proved pivotal. Adams developed a close relationship with Tsar Alexander I, who admired the American's intellect and appreciated having access to information about the English-speaking world. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, Adams had a front-row seat to one of history's greatest military disasters. He witnessed the aftermath of the French retreat, saw the devastation of war, and reported extensively to Washington about the shifting balance of European power. While in Russia, Adams learned that the United States had declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 dismayed him. He understood the provocations, the British seizure of American ships, and impressment of sailors. But he also recognized that America was poorly prepared for war, and that the conflict could only benefit Napoleon, whom Adams viewed as a tyrant. When Tsar Alexander offered to mediate the dispute, Adams encouraged both his own government and the British to accept, though ultimately Britain declined Russian mediation. In 1814, Madison appointed Adams to head the American delegation negotiating peace with Britain. The Treaty of Ghent negotiations represented perhaps the finest moment in Adams's diplomatic career. Joined by Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, James Bayard, and Jonathan Russell, Adams confronted a British delegation determined to extract significant concessions from what they viewed as an upstart nation that had been soundly beaten in war. The British demanded American territory, restrictions on American fishing rights, and the creation of an Indian buffer state in the Northwest. Adams refused to yield on any essential point. Through months of difficult negotiations, enduring both British intransigence and friction within his own delegation, he held firm. Clay, brilliant but undisciplined, often clashed with the rigid Adams. The two men could hardly have been more different. Clay was all charm and flexibility, while Adams was principle and stubborn rectitude. Yet somehow, they fashioned a treaty that restored the status quo ante bellum, securing American honor without conceding any fundamental American interests. News of the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, reached America roughly simultaneously with news of Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at New Orleans. Americans celebrated both events as evidence of national triumph. Though Adams understood that the military situation had actually been dire and that the treaty represented a triumph of diplomacy rather than arms. Nevertheless, the peace made him a hero at home. From Ghent, Adams went to London as American minister to the court of St. James, the same position his father had held 3 decades earlier. For 2 years, he worked to resolve outstanding issues between the two nations, establishing good working relationships with British officials and helping to create the framework for the peaceful Anglo-American relations that would eventually develop. He also spent time with his son George, who was studying in England, and tried to be the kind of father he had rarely experienced himself. For the next 8 years, he would serve as arguably the greatest Secretary of State in American history. reshaping American foreign policy and dramatically expanding national territory. Adams's tenure at the State Department produced a series of diplomatic triumphs. The Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817 demilitarized the Great Lakes, setting the stage for the undefended border between the United States and Canada. The Convention of 1818 established the northern border of the Louisiana Purchase at the 49th parallel, extending from Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains, and guaranteed American fishing rights off Newfoundland. But Adams's greatest achievement was the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 with Spain, also known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. Through shrewd negotiation with Spanish minister Luis de Onis, Adams secured Florida for the United States and, more significantly, established a clear boundary between Spanish and American territory extending all the way to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time, the United States was explicitly recognized as a transcontinental nation with a legitimate claim to the Pacific coast. The treaty represented a stunning diplomatic victory, obtained without war and at minimal cost. During these negotiations, Adams demonstrated a combination of patience, vision, and tactical brilliance. He understood that Spain's position in the Americas was weakening. That revolution was spreading through Spanish colonies, and that time favored American interests. He resisted pressure from warhawks who wanted to simply seize Florida, recognizing that patience would yield better results. When Andrew Jackson invaded Florida in 1818 without authorization and created an international incident, Adams alone in the cabinet defended Jackson's actions, arguing that Spanish weakness had made intervention necessary and warning Spain that further incidents would occur unless they ceded the territory. The Transcontinental Treaty showcased Adams's broad vision for American expansion. While others focused on Florida, Adams insisted on a transcontinental boundary, securing American claims to the Oregon Territory and opening the path to the Pacific. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his contemporaries, the geographic destiny of the United States as a continental power. Adams's other great contribution to American foreign policy came in 1823, when he played a crucial role in formulating what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. When Britain suggested a joint declaration warning European powers against intervention in Latin America, President Monroe was inclined to accept. Adams argued strenuously against it, insisting that America should act independently rather than appear to be following in Britain's wake. His view prevailed, and Monroe's annual message to Congress included language largely drafted by Adams, declaring that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization and that European intervention in independent American nations would be viewed as hostile to the United States. The Monroe Doctrine would become a cornerstone of American foreign policy for generations. While its immediate practical impact was limited, since British naval power actually enforced non-intervention, it established a principle of hemispheric hegemony that would shape American diplomacy for the next 2 centuries. Adams had articulated a vision of American power and American interests that was both assertive and sustainable. Despite his success as Secretary of State, Adams's personality made him few friends and many enemies in Washington. He was principled to the point of rigidity, unwilling to engage in the social niceties and political trading that lubricated the machinery of government. He found the growing democratic politics of the Jacksonian era distasteful, viewing appeals to popular sentiment as demagoguery. His diary entries from this period reveal a man of profound intellect and equally profound self-doubt, constantly questioning his own motives and abilities even as he achieved remarkable success. As Monroe's second term approached its end, attention turned to the 1824 presidential election. Adams wanted the presidency, though he could barely bring himself to admit it, even in his diary. The traditional understanding was that the Secretary of State succeeded to the presidency, as Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had all done. But Adams faced formidable competitors: Andrew Jackson, the military hero; Henry Clay, the brilliant Speaker of the House; William Crawford, Monroe's Treasury Secretary; and John Calhoun, Monroe's Secretary of War. The campaign of 1824 was unlike anything Americans had previously experienced. The old Federalist Party had dissolved, and all candidates ran as Democratic Republicans, making the contest essentially a factional fight within a single party. With no formal party machinery, campaigns became intensely personal. Adams's supporters praised his intellect, experience, and diplomatic achievements. His opponents attacked him as an elitist, an aristocrat who disdained ordinary people, the beneficiary of family connections rather than genuine merit. Adams's personal campaigning was virtually non-existent. He believed that actively seeking office was beneath the dignity of the position, and that merit should speak for itself. This high-minded approach proved disastrous in an era when politics was becoming increasingly democratic and populist. Jackson, by contrast, was a natural campaigner whose military fame and frontier image appealed to ordinary voters in a way Adams never could. When the votes were counted, Jackson won a plurality of both popular and electoral votes. But no candidate secured the electoral majority required by the Constitution. The election went to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation would cast a single vote. Jackson had 99 electoral votes, Adams 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. With Clay eliminated, his support would likely prove decisive. Clay faced a momentous choice. He despised Jackson, whom he viewed as a dangerous military man, unsuited for civilian leadership. He had clashed repeatedly with Adams over the years, and found him cold and difficult. Yet Clay believed Adams was far better qualified than Jackson, and shared his broad, nationalist vision for American development. After agonizing deliberation, Clay threw his support to Adams. On February 9, 1825, the House elected John Quincy Adams as the 6th President of the United States. Adams won 13 states, to Jackson's 7, with Crawford taking 4. Adams had achieved the position his parents had prepared him for since childhood, the culmination of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. He should have been triumphant. Instead, the victory was immediately poisoned by accusations of a corrupt bargain. When Adams appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters exploded in fury. They claimed that Adams and Clay had made a deal. Clay would deliver the presidency to Adams in exchange for the State Department and presumptive succession to the presidency. Jackson himself declared that the will of the people had been thwarted by corrupt politicians in a smoke-filled room. The charge of corrupt bargain would haunt Adams throughout his presidency and beyond. No evidence of an explicit deal has ever been found, and most historians believe Clay's support for Adams reflected genuine policy agreement rather than corrupt bargaining. But in politics, perception often matters more than reality. Jackson's supporters spent the next 4 years attacking Adams's legitimacy, and their anger energized what would become the Democratic Party. Dedicated to electing Jackson in 1828 and preventing anything like the 1824 election from ever happening again, Adams's presidency was star-crossed from the start. His ambitious program of national improvement, articulated in his first annual message to Congress, called for a comprehensive system of roads and canals, a national university, a naval academy, scientific expeditions, astronomical observatories, and standardization of weights and measures. He envisioned an activist federal government promoting education, science, and economic development. It was a bold, nationalist agenda that would have thrilled Alexander Hamilton, but it crashed against the rising tide of states' rights sentiment and limited government ideology. Jackson's supporters in Congress, led by Martin Van Buren, opposed virtually everything Adams proposed. Not on policy grounds, but to deny him political victories and ensure his defeat in 1828. Adams's high-minded refusal to use patronage or engage in political horse-trading left him without the tools to build congressional coalitions. His major legislative achievements were few. He secured funding for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and for extensions to the Cumberland Road. But his grander visions died in Congress. In foreign affairs, Adams met similar frustration. He sought to expand American trade through treaties with new Latin American republics and with the Ottoman Empire. He sent delegates to a Pan-American conference in Panama, envisioning a hemisphere united by republican principles and commercial exchange. But Southern congressmen, horrified that the conference might address slavery, or that American diplomats might interact with delegates. From Haiti, where slaves had successfully revolted, blocked the initiative until it was too late for meaningful participation. Adams's Indian policy reflected both progressive impulses and the racial assumptions of his era. He opposed the forced removal of Native Americans from their lands, believing that treaties should be honored and that indigenous peoples should be gradually assimilated into American society through education and Christianity. He resisted Georgia's increasingly aggressive demands to expel the Cherokee and Creek nations from lands guaranteed by federal treaty. But his moral position on Indian rights proved as politically unpopular as his other initiatives, particularly in the South and West, where most Americans supported removal. The presidency isolated Adams even more than previous positions had. Louisa, never robust, struggled with the demands of being First Lady. She fulfilled the social obligations required of the role, but found the work exhausting and the attacks on her husband deeply wounding. Adams himself worked obsessively, rising before dawn to write, study, and prepare for the day's meetings. His famous morning swims in the Potomac River, where he would sometimes spend an hour in the water, regardless of season, became legendary and provided his only regular recreation. As the 1828 election approached, Adams knew he would face Jackson again. And this time the outcome seemed foreordained. The intervening years had seen the transformation of American politics. Jackson's supporters had built the first truly national political organization, with networks of newspapers, local committees, and operatives in every state. They had perfected techniques of mass mobilization, appealing directly to ordinary voters rather than to the educated elite that Adams represented. The 1828 campaign plumbed depths of personal vituperation that shocked even cynical observers. Jackson's supporters attacked Adams as an elitist aristocrat who had wasted public money on gambling equipment for the White House, a charge based on the fact that Adams had purchased a billiard table with his own funds. They portrayed him as a would-be monarch, out of touch with ordinary Americans, a man who had sold his soul for the presidency through the corrupt bargain with Clay. Adams's supporters responded with equally vicious attacks on Jackson, questioning his marriage to Rachel Jackson, who had inadvertently committed bigamy when her divorce from her first husband was not yet final when she married Jackson. They called her an adulteress and Jackson a wife-stealer. Attacks that devastated Rachel and may have contributed to her death shortly after the election. Adams himself refused to actively campaign, maintaining that the dignity of the presidency precluded it. In retrospect, this seems almost willfully self-destructive, but it reflected his deeply held beliefs about how politics should work. Merit and accomplishment should matter, not personality and popularity. Reason should prevail over passion. The people should choose leaders based on qualifications rather than charm. Jackson crushed Adams in the Electoral College, 178-83, winning everywhere outside New England and parts of the Mid. The popular vote was similarly lopsided. It was a devastating repudiation, made more painful by Adams's belief that the American people had chosen a dangerous demagogue over an experienced statesman. His last months in office were consumed with bitterness and depression. When Jackson arrived in Washington for the inauguration, Adams refused to meet with him or participate in the ceremony, leaving Washington on the morning of Jackson's inauguration. At age 61, John Quincy Adams seemed finished with public life. He returned to Quincy, Massachusetts, expecting to spend his remaining years in the study and retirement his father had enjoyed. For months, he brooded, writing in his diary about his failures and defeats, questioning whether his entire life's work had been worthwhile. The depression that had haunted him throughout his life threatened to overwhelm him. But then something remarkable happened. In 1830, some citizens of his district approached Adams about running for the House of Representatives. The suggestion initially struck him as absurd. No former president had ever served in Congress afterward. It seemed like a massive step down, an admission of diminished status. But as Adams considered it, he realized that service in Congress might offer something the presidency had denied him: a platform to speak and act according to his principles without the constraints of executive office. He ran and won easily, beginning in 1831 what would become the most meaningful period of his life. For the next 17 years, until his death, Adams served in the House of Representatives, transforming himself from a failed president into one of the greatest champions of freedom in American history. In Congress, Adams finally found his true calling. Freed from executive responsibilities and partisan expectations, he became an independent moral voice, particularly on the great issue that was tearing the nation apart, slavery. Throughout his earlier career, Adams had avoided the subject when possible, recognizing it as politically explosive and believing, like many Northerners, that it would eventually disappear on its own. But by the 1830s, the expansion of cotton cultivation in the Deep South had entrenched slavery more deeply than ever, and Southern politicians were demanding not just protection for slavery where it existed, but expansion into new territories and suppression of anti-slavery speech. Adams began receiving petitions from constituents asking Congress to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, where Congress had unquestioned constitutional authority. He presented these petitions on the House floor, as was his constitutional right and duty as a representative. Southern congressmen, supported by Northern Democrats, erupted in fury. In 1836, they passed a gag rule, automatically tabling all anti-slavery petitions without consideration. The gag rule ignited Adams's passion for liberty in a way nothing else in his long career had done. He viewed it as an assault on the constitutional right to petition government, on freedom of speech, and on the basic principles of Republican government. For 8 years, Adams waged a relentless campaign against the gag rule, using every parliamentary maneuver and rhetorical weapon at his disposal. He found loopholes in the rule, presented petitions from slaves themselves, and forced votes on the issue again and again. His opponents called him a fanatic and worse. Southerners regularly threatened him with violence. A congressman from Virginia challenged him to a duel, which Adams, now in his 70s, calmly accepted before the challenge was withdrawn. Attempts were made to censure him. Throughout it all, Adams stood firm, delivering speeches that electrified abolitionists and enraged the South. He was no longer the cold, aloof diplomat. He had become a passionate advocate for human freedom, wielding moral authority and parliamentary skill with devastating effect. Adams did not initially identify as an abolitionist. He approached the issue through constitutional principles rather than moral absolutism. But his position evolved. The more he fought the gag rule, the more he examined slavery itself, the more convinced he became of its fundamental evil. He began working closely with abolitionists, lending his prestige and skill to their cause. When younger abolitionists like Joshua Giddings faced censure for anti-slavery advocacy, Adams defended them with fierce determination. In 1841, Adams took on his most famous case. The slave ship Amistad had been seized off the coast of Connecticut after the enslaved Africans on board, led by Joseph Sink, had revolted and killed their captors. Lower courts had ruled that the Africans should be freed and returned to Africa, but the Van Buren administration, seeking Southern support, appealed to the Supreme Court. The African supporters asked the 73-year-old former president to argue their case. Adams had not argued before the Supreme Court in decades and had never been a courtroom advocate. But he could not refuse. For 8 hours over 2 days, he presented the Africans' case, arguing that they were free people who had been kidnapped, that they had every right to resist their captivity, and that American ideals of liberty demanded their freedom. He invoked the Declaration of Independence, natural law, and international treaties. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Africans, and Adams's argument became one of the most celebrated legal performances in American history. Throughout the 1840s, Adams remained a central figure in Congress. He opposed the annexation of Texas, recognizing it as a scheme to expand slavery and dreading the war with Mexico that would likely follow. When the Mexican War began in 1846, Adams opposed it vehemently, viewing it as an unjust war of aggression designed to acquire territory for slavery's expansion. He was one of 14 congressmen to vote against thanking General Zachary Taylor for his victories, a vote that made him deeply unpopular but reflected his conviction that the war was immoral. Finally, in 1844, Adams achieved his greatest congressional victory when the House voted to repeal the gag rule. For 8 years, he had stood almost alone. Gradually, allies had joined him. Northern public opinion had shifted as people recognized the gag rule as an assault on fundamental rights. When the vote came, the gag rule was lifted, a triumph of persistence and principle over political expedience. It was perhaps Adams's finest moment, vindicating his long struggle and demonstrating that one determined individual could change the course of history. By 1848, Adams was 80 years old. His health had declined, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment undiminished. On February 21, 1848, he was at his desk in the House chamber when he suffered a massive stroke. He collapsed, crying out, and was caught by colleagues before he fell to the floor. They carried him to the Speaker's room, where he lay for 2 days, drifting in and out of consciousness. The House suspended its business, and members of both parties kept vigil. His last recorded words were fitting: "This is the last of earth. I am content." On February 23, 1848, John Quincy Adams died in the Capitol building he had served for 17 years. He was the only president to die in the Capitol, a symbol of his lifelong devotion to public service. The nation mourned. Congress adjourned. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda before being returned to Massachusetts. Even many who had opposed him politically acknowledged his integrity, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to principle. Abraham Lincoln, then a young congressman from Illinois, served on the committee that planned the funeral ceremonies. The experience of watching Adams's courageous stand against slavery made a profound impression on Lincoln and influenced his own evolving views on the issue. John Quincy Adams was laid to rest in the family crypt at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, beside his parents and, eventually, his wife Louisa, who survived him by 4 years. The church still stands, a quiet memorial to America's most extraordinary political dynasty. Assessing Adams's legacy requires grappling with the contradictions of a complex man. As president, he failed. His legislative agenda went nowhere. His political skills were negligible, and his single term ended in humiliating defeat. Yet his accomplishments as Secretary of State were extraordinary, fundamentally shaping American foreign policy and territorial expansion. But perhaps Adams's greatest legacy was his final act. His 17 years in Congress, fighting slavery and defending constitutional liberties. He showed that defeat need not be final, that principle could triumph over expedience, and that one person's courage could matter. The young abolitionists who watched Old Man Eloquent battle the slave power drew inspiration that sustained them through the long struggle ahead. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 15 years after Adams's death, he vindicated Adams's conviction that slavery was incompatible with American principles. Adams's personal life was marked by as much struggle as his public career. His marriage to Louisa, while enduring, was often strained by his emotional distance and single-minded devotion to duty. His sons struggled with the weight of family expectations. George Washington Adams, his eldest, suffered from mental illness and alcoholism before drowning in 1829 in what may have been suicide. John Adams too died of alcoholism in 1834. Charles Francis Adams, the youngest, managed to forge a successful career as a congressman and diplomat, carrying the family tradition forward, but even he found his father's expectations crushing. Adams himself battled depression throughout his life, recording in his diary episodes of despair and self-doubt that would likely be diagnosed as clinical depression today. His perfectionism and harsh self-judgment made him his own worst critic. Yet somehow, he persevered, finding the strength to rise each morning, to continue working, to keep fighting for what he believed was right. His diary, kept faithfully from age 12 until just days before his death, provides an unparalleled window into his inner life and the America he lived through. Running to millions of words across 69 years, it records his thoughts on everything from grand matters of state, to personal relationships, to the books he read, and the weather. It reveals a man of profound learning, moral seriousness, and painful self-awareness. Future generations of historians would mine it as one of the most important primary sources for understanding early American history. Adams lived through the entire founding era of the United States. He remembered the Revolution, knew the founders personally, served under 4 of the first 5 presidents, and lived to see the United States transformed from a fragile confederation of coastal states into a continental power. He witnessed the birth of mass democracy, the rise of sectional conflict over slavery, and the westward expansion that would define the 19th century. In many ways, Adams represented values and assumptions that were already becoming obsolete during his lifetime. He believed in rule by a natural aristocracy of talent and virtue, not rule by the common man. He thought government should actively promote the public good through internal improvements and educational institutions, not simply referee disputes between private interests. He believed politicians should act according to principle rather than popular opinion, that statesmanship meant having the courage to make unpopular decisions for the long-term good of the nation. The Jacksonian era rejected all these assumptions. Democracy meant empowering ordinary people, not deferring to educated elites. Government should be limited, not activist. Politicians should follow popular will, not impose their own judgment. In this context, Adams seemed like a relic, an artifact of an earlier age that America had outgrown. Yet history has been kinder to Adams than his own era was. His vision of an active federal government promoting education and infrastructure would eventually triumph. His defense of constitutional principles against majoritarian tyranny resonated with later generations. His courage in fighting slavery helped lay the groundwork for its eventual abolition. The qualities that made him a poor politician, his refusal to compromise principle for expedience, his commitment to unpopular truths, came to be seen as virtues rather than weaknesses. Adams's intellectual legacy was equally impressive. He published books on rhetoric, wrote poetry, and translated German literature. His report on weights and measures remains a masterpiece of scientific and historical analysis. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and spent years working on a new translation of the Bible. His erudition was genuine and deep, not the superficial learning of a dilettante, but the hard-won knowledge of a lifetime devoted to study. He also contributed to American astronomy, using his position to advocate for government support of scientific research. His speeches calling for astronomical observatories, which some legislators mocked as lighthouses of the skies, eventually led to federal support for astronomy. The Naval Observatory owes its existence partly to Adams's advocacy. He understood that national greatness required not just military power and economic growth, but also contributions to human knowledge. In the 21st century, John Quincy Adams has found new relevance. His diplomatic achievements remain models of strategic thinking and patient negotiation. His principled stands on slavery and civil liberties inspire those fighting for justice today. His diary has been digitized and made available online, allowing new generations to encounter his brilliant, tortured, extraordinary mind. Biographies continue to appear, reassessing his life and legacy for contemporary audiences. Adams's life offers lessons for every generation. It demonstrates that failure can be a prelude to greater achievement, that the most important battles are often fought after the conventional markers of success have been achieved, and persistence in the face of overwhelming opposition. It reveals that true leadership sometimes means standing alone, speaking unpopular truths, and trusting that history will vindicate positions that contemporaries reject. His greatest lesson may be about the relationship between intellect and character. Adams possessed one of the finest minds ever to occupy the presidency, yet intelligence alone did not make him successful. His presidency failed not because he lacked understanding, but because he lacked the human skills necessary to translate understanding into political achievement. He could analyze problems brilliantly, but struggled to persuade others to accept his solutions. He could see the right path, but could not inspire people to follow him down it. Yet that same rigidity of character, that inability to compromise or dissemble, became his greatest strength when fighting slavery. The political flexibility that might have made him a more successful president would have made him a less effective moral crusader. The question this raises is profound. are the qualities that make for political success compatible with the qualities required for moral leadership. Adams's life suggests they may not be. That sometimes the greatest service comes from those willing to sacrifice political advancement for principle. Adams's religious faith evolved throughout his life. Raised in the rational Unitarian tradition of New England, he was deeply Christian, but rejected traditional Calvinist doctrines of predestination and original sin. He believed in a God of reason and benevolence, in the moral teachings of Jesus, rather than elaborate theological systems. His faith sustained him through personal tragedies and political defeats. Though his diary reveals ongoing struggles with doubt and a tendency towards self-flagellation that suggests lingering Calvinist influences despite his conscious rejection of that tradition. His relationship with his father loomed over his entire life. John Adams lived until 1826, dying at age 90 on July 4th, the same day as Thomas Jefferson, and exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. By then, John Quincy was president, having finally achieved what his father had prepared him for. Yet even then, he felt he had disappointed the old man, that his accomplishments paled beside his father's role in founding the nation. The psychological burden of being John Adams's son, of carrying the weight of revolutionary expectations, shaped John Quincy's personality in ways both productive and destructive. His mother's influence was equally powerful, and perhaps more complex. Abigail Adams was the intellectual force behind John Quincy's education, the one who drilled classical languages into him, who expected moral perfection, who held before him an ideal of public service so demanding that no human could fully achieve it. Her letters to him, filled with love but also crushing expectations, reveal a relationship of deep affection and equally deep anxiety. She worried constantly that he would fail, that he would not live up to the family name, that he would disappoint her. These worries became his own, internalized so deeply that even his greatest achievements felt insufficient. The Adams family papers, preserved at the Massachusetts Historical Society, contained thousands of letters between family members, creating an extraordinary documentary record of their lives. Reading through this correspondence, one encounters the full humanity of these historical figures, their loves and hatreds, their petty jealousies and noble aspirations, their moments of joy and periods of despair. John Quincy emerges from these documents as a man of fierce intellect and equally fierce of doubt, capable of great warmth but often unable to express it, devoted to family yet frequently absent from them. His relationship with his sons was tragically marked by the same patterns that had defined his relationship with his own father. He loved them, but struggled to show it. He expected great things from them, but gave them little guidance on how to achieve those expectations. He was often physically absent during their childhoods due to diplomatic assignments, and emotionally distant even when present. The pressure of being an Adams, of living up to a family legacy of public service and achievement, proved crushing for George and John II. Even Charles Francis, who succeeded where his brothers failed, struggled with feelings of inadequacy and the burden of family expectations. The tragedy of the Adams sons raises uncomfortable questions about the cost of public service and the price families pay for their members' devotion to country. John Quincy sacrificed much for his career: ordinary family life, emotional connection, perhaps even his own happiness. His sons paid an even higher price, suffering from a father who was physically present but emotionally unavailable, who demanded perfection but provided little support. The pattern would repeat in later generations of the Adams family, suggesting that the dysfunction was systemic rather than individual. Yet Louisa Catherine Adams deserves recognition as a figure of strength and resilience in her own right. She endured brutal Russian winters, the loss of an infant daughter, long separations from her other children, and years of living in her mother-in-law's shadow. She managed the social aspects of John Quincy's career while receiving little credit or recognition. Her own writings, including a remarkable memoir called Adventures of a Nobody, reveal a woman of intelligence, wit, and frustrated ambition, someone who might have accomplished great things had she been born male or in a different era. Louisa's experience illuminates the position of women in early Republican America. Even highly educated, Capable women like Louisa and Abigail had no formal political role, no independent legal identity, no outlet for their talents beyond the domestic sphere. They could influence politics only through their husbands and sons, exercising power indirectly through the men in their lives. This reality shaped how they raised their children, particularly their sons, investing enormous emotional energy in boys who would have the opportunities denied to their mothers. John Quincy's views on women's rights were progressive for his time, but limited by contemporary standards. He supported women's education, believing that mothers needed knowledge to properly educate their children. He admired intelligent women and enjoyed their conversation. But he never questioned the fundamental structure of gender hierarchy, never imagined that women might hold office or vote or exercise independent political power. His vision of Republican government, despite its many admirable qualities, remained exclusively male. On race, Adams's record was more complicated and more admirable. His opposition to slavery grew stronger over time, until by his final years he had become one of its most effective enemies. Yet he never fully escaped the racial assumptions of his era. He believed in racial equality before the law, and opposed slavery on moral and constitutional grounds. But he also doubted whether free blacks and whites could live together harmoniously in the same society. He supported colonization schemes that would have sent freed slaves to Africa, though he came to doubt their practicality. His position on Indian removal, while more humane than Jackson's, still assumed that Native Americans should abandon their cultures and assimilate into white American society. These limitations were typical of even progressive white Americans in the antebellum period. Opposing slavery did not necessarily mean believing in racial equality or supporting integration. Many white abolitionists imagined a future America without slavery but also without significant black population. Adams's position was perhaps more enlightened than most, particularly his willingness to present petitions from free blacks and defend their rights, but it remained constrained by racial assumptions he never fully examined or rejected. The America that Adams helped shape bore little resemblance to the nation he was born into. The 13 struggling colonies of 1767 had become a continental power of 30 states by 1848. The population had grown from about 2 million to over 20 million. The economy had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution, by the cotton boom, by the expansion of slavery in the South, and wage labor in the North. The political system had democratized dramatically, with property requirements for voting abolished in most states, and mass political parties mobilizing millions of voters. Adams lived long enough to see the telegraph demonstrated, to watch railroads begin crisscrossing the country, to witness the beginnings of photography. He saw the rise of the penny press creating mass media, the emergence of reform movements addressing temperance and education and women's rights, the religious enthusiasm of the Second Great Awakening transforming American spiritual life. He experienced more change in his 80 years than most civilizations see in centuries. Yet for all the changes, certain fundamental tensions remained unresolved and indeed grew more severe during Adams's lifetime. The sectional conflict over slavery that he fought so hard to address would explode into civil war just 13 years after his death. The questions about federal power versus states' rights that divided him from Jackson remained central to American political debate. The tension between democratic equality and elitist expertise that undermined his presidency continues to shape American politics. Adams's predictions about slavery proved tragically prescient. He warned repeatedly that the institution would destroy the Union if not addressed. That compromise and delay only made eventual conflict more likely and more terrible. He foresaw that slavery's expansion would provoke Northern resistance, that the South's political power would eventually decline as free states outnumbered slave states, and that Southern leaders would then face a choice between accepting democratic defeat or dissolving the Union. When war finally came, it followed almost exactly the trajectory Adams had predicted. His warnings went unheeded in his own time. Most Americans, North and South, preferred to avoid the issue, to paper over differences with compromises that temporarily reduced tensions while ensuring future explosions. Adams's insistence on confronting slavery directly, on forcing the nation to grapple with the contradiction between American ideals and American practice, made him seem like a divisive extremist. Only in retrospect did his position appear as clear-eyed realism, while the compromises were revealed as delusional. The evolution of Adams's reputation reflects broader patterns in American historiography. 19th-century historians, influenced by the Democratic Party's dominance and still shaped by Jacksonian assumptions, generally portrayed Adams as a failed president and elitist snob. Early 20th century progressive historians began reassessing his presidency more favorably, appreciating his nationalist vision and activist government philosophy. Mid-20th century historians, influenced by the civil rights movement, elevated his anti-slavery work to central importance. Recent scholarship has produced the most nuanced assessment, recognizing both his genuine accomplishments and his significant limitations. Historians now appreciate his diplomatic brilliance while acknowledging his political ineptitude, admire his moral courage while noting his emotional coldness, respect his intellectual achievements while recognizing his psychological struggles. He emerges from recent biographies as a fully human figure, brilliant and flawed, admirable and frustrating, a man whose virtues and vices were inextricably linked. The physical remnants of Adams's life remain scattered across the American landscape. His birthplace in Quincy stands preserved, a modest colonial house that seems impossibly small for the giant intellect it produced. The family home at Peacefield, where both John and John Quincy returned between public assignments, contains their books and furniture, creating an intimate connection to their daily lives. In Washington, a small desk in the Capitol marks the spot where he suffered his fatal stroke. His grave in Quincy draws visitors who come to pay respects to a man whose reputation has only grown with time. His writings continue to attract readers and scholars. The diary, now fully published in multiple volumes, remains an inexhaustible source for historians of early America. His speeches and diplomatic correspondence are studied in law schools and international relations programs. His poetry, while not achieving lasting literary significance, reveals aspects of his personality rarely visible in official documents. His letters to his children, especially his son Charles Francis, offer guidance that remains relevant. The importance of education, the value of self-discipline, the necessity of contributing to society. In the canon of American presidents, Adams occupies an unusual position. He is widely regarded as one of the most intelligent men ever to hold the office, perhaps exceeded only by Jefferson in the breadth of his learning. Yet, he is also considered one of the least successful presidents, unable to translate intelligence into political achievement. This paradox has fascinated historians and political scientists, prompting analysis of what qualities actually matter in presidential leadership. The conventional wisdom is that Adams's presidency failed because he lacked political skills. He couldn't build coalitions, couldn't compromise, couldn't inspire followers, couldn't adapt his message to his audience. All of this is true, but it perhaps misses a deeper point. Adams's vision for America was fundamentally at odds with the direction the country was moving. He wanted an activist government promoting education and infrastructure when Americans were embracing limited government. He believed in rule by merit when Americans wanted democracy. He thought long-term planning and rational policy should guide decisions when Americans increasingly valued responsiveness to popular will. In this sense, Adams's failure as president reflected not just personal limitations but a fundamental misalignment between his values and his era's values. He was offering answers to questions Americans were not asking and ignoring questions they desperately wanted answered. A more politically skilled person might have disguised this misalignment better, might have found ways to partially achieve his goals by accepting compromise, but the fundamental tension would have remained. His success as a congressman, conversely, reflected perfect alignment between his strengths and his position's requirements. In Congress, moral authority mattered more than coalition building. Rhetorical skill and command of procedure could substitute for political flexibility. Standing alone on principle was not just acceptable but admirable. The House of Representatives in the 1830s and 1840s needed exactly what Adams offered: a voice of conscience, willing to challenge the slave power, regardless of political consequences. The irony is that Adams achieved his greatest impact, not through the presidency he had spent his life preparing for, but through the lesser office he initially considered beneath him. This suggests that success in life requires not just talent and effort, but also finding the right fit between one's abilities and one's position. Adams's tragedy was spending so many years in roles that demanded skills he lacked, while his genuine gifts remained underutilized. His triumph was recognizing, at an age when most people would have retired, that he still had important work to do, and finding a platform from which to do it. During the Civil War era, he was remembered primarily as an anti-slavery champion, a forerunner of Lincoln and the Republicans who had vindicated his warnings about slavery's incompatibility with the Union. During the Progressive Era and New Deal, his nationalist vision and support for active government made him a progressive, offering historical validation for federal activism. During the Cold War, his diplomatic achievements and firm opposition to foreign threats made him relevant to debates about American foreign policy. In the early 21st century, Adams speaks to contemporary concerns about the relationship between expertise and democracy, about how societies should address fundamental moral questions, about the costs of public service and the requirements of leadership. His life raises questions that remain unanswered. Can democracies make wise long-term decisions when short-term political incentives dominate? John Quincy Adams never stopped fighting. That was both his blessing and his curse. He could never rest, never feel satisfied with his accomplishments, never quiet the voice inside demanding more. His father had helped create a nation, and he felt obligated to live up to that impossible standard. The pressure drove him to extraordinary achievements, but also made happiness elusive and peace impossible. Yet perhaps that restlessness was appropriate for a man living through revolutionary times. The America of his birth was an impossible dream that somehow came true. The America of his death was an improbable empire that had exceeded its founders' wildest visions. The transformation required people who refused to accept limitations, who believed that nations could be shaped by human will and effort, who devoted themselves entirely to public service regardless of personal cost. Adams embodied both the glory and the cost of that transformation. He sacrificed ordinary happiness for extraordinary accomplishment. He gave his family an honored name at the price of emotional connection. He secured his place in history by accepting loneliness in life. Whether that trade was worth it is a question each person must answer according to their own values. Adams himself, in his darker moments, sometimes doubted it, but he never stopped making the same choice, never stopped sacrificing personal comfort for what he believed was right. When he collapsed on the House floor that February day in 1848, he died as he had lived, at his post, still fighting, never surrendering. There are worse epitaphs for a life in public service. He had been president and failed, but he had also been a voice for the voiceless, a defender of constitutional liberties, a champion of human freedom. History has judged that the latter achievements matter more than the former failure. John Quincy Adams was not a man of his time. He was too intellectual for an anti-intellectual age, too principled for a pragmatic era, too nationalist for a period of state sovereignty, too morally demanding for a society that preferred comfortable compromises to uncomfortable truths. But he was a man for all time, whose courage and commitment to principle transcend his particular historical moment. He was born into a world of colonial subservience and died in a nation of continental empire. He witnessed the birth of American democracy and struggled against its darker implications. He helped expand American territory and fought to ensure that expansion served freedom rather than slavery. He was brilliant and difficult, accomplished and frustrated, admired and lonely. He was, in short, magnificently human. A man whose extraordinary life illuminates both the possibilities and limitations of human achievement. His legacy endures, not just in specific policies or diplomatic achievements, but in the example he set, that public service is a noble calling. That principle matters more than popularity, that the fight for justice requires courage and persistence, and that it is never too late to find your true purpose. John Quincy Adams spent his entire life trying to live up to impossible expectations. In his final years, he finally stopped trying to be what others wanted and became fully himself.